We often read and written find, as learned men do us remind, that lays that now the harpers sing are wrought of many a marvellous thing. Some are of weal and some of woe, and some do joy and gladness know, and some are guile and treachery told, and some the deeds that chanced of old. Some are jests and ribaldry, and some are tales of Faeries. Of all the things that men may heed, 'tis most of love they sing indeed. Thus begins the Middle English romance of Sir Orfeo, marking its third appearance on this channel, but first proper examination. For today we are discussing perhaps the most lasting legend of the medieval world, fairies, their abductions, seductions, and bewilderments. Though the creatures hold a distinctly pagan origin, they rose to prominence in Anglo-Norman Britain, heavily influenced by tales of the Gaelic West and French East. Their single through line is another world. Past that, they're beyond recognition, though their habits persist, often abducting the vulnerable, seducing the strong, or bewitching the curious. Their legends lasted well into the modern period, often intertwined with the most popular of their era, with such a prominent influence on culture that political actions were sometimes affected. Now, without further ado, let us begin. Our journey first takes us down the rolling hills of southern England, where in the 13th century an anonymous poet composed the opening lines of this video in the southeastern dialect of Middle English. We readeth oft and findeth irite, and this clercus welle it wite. Lais that ben in harpin, benny found a furly thing. Sir Orfeo, as the name suggests, is a medieval retelling of Orpheus and Eurydice, heavily based on the tale as given by Boethius in 6th century Rome. Orfeo is described as a musician king in England, whose wife Eurydice, haunted by visions of impending doom, was taken to the otherworld by the fairy king. Upon discovering the fate of his wife, the monarch forsook his crown and entered the wilderness, mourning many a year before by chance of fate, seeing Eurydice ride by amidst a fairy host. Following them to a cliffside, he entered the rock, traveling many miles before emerging in paradise, a fact displayed by the various states of its inhabitants. A folk that were thither drawn below, and mourned as dead, but were not so. For some there stood who had no head, and some no arms nor feet, some bled. Orfeo, traversing through the crowds, eventually reaches the king and queen, whom he begged hear a tune, successfully charming both and winning his wife Eurydice to take home, reclaiming his crown and living his days in bliss. The most obvious contrast between this and the mythological tale is the happy ending our author provided. As students of the classics ought well know that Orpheus lost Eurydice, turning his gaze to never see her again, only to be later torn apart by followers of Bacchus. Though perhaps more interesting still is the depiction of fairies it provides, placing their king in the seats of Pluto, and making them de facto rulers of paradise. This depiction is of the utmost importance because it highlights the often amoral nature these beings present, as they range from main antagonist to distinct love interest. Furthermore, the otherworld's entrance should be noted, as it plays on the often secret nature and far-off location of the fairy world, clearly informed by tales of the time. Irish legend upheld the otherworld's location far beyond the Western Sea, whilst the Britons and later Manx people believed in their residence on the Isle of Man, though perhaps no island was more famous for its magical qualities than that of Avalon, said to host the mythical King Arthur in active recovery. Named by 14th century monk John Lydgate as the Kingy Crowned in Fairy, it's said he remains actively tended to by 4 fairy queens, till one day return and lead his people to victory. An obvious expansion of the legend coming to us from Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae, and one so persistent that Edward I, during his conquest of Wales, would exhume the mythical king's alleged tomb, certifying its contents with the royal seal, intent on showing the Brittonic people, in the words of Mark Morris, that no one was coming to save them. It should be clear through this comparison that the legend of fairies became over time inextricably tied with those of Camelot, even when not explicitly named. Crossing the English Channel, we find the tale of Lanval. A Lais of Marie de France, it relays the story of the aforementioned knight, recounting how he, when overlooked and underserved, was visited by a maiden whose beauty surpassed the lily and the new rose when it appears in summer. A maiden who swore that her love and blessings would be everlasting so long as he pledged to never mention her, with the knight quickly realizing that she was no dream, but of the fairy realm. Lanval quickly rose in stature, housing many a knight and gaining prominence in the court, attracting the eye of Queen Guinevere, who, failing to seduce him, suggested he perhaps enjoyed the company of men. Angered by her arrogance, Lanval mentioned his fair lady, declaring that even her lowest servant was worth more in body, face, beauty, wisdom, and goodness than the adulterous queen. Upon realizing what he said and the consequences soon to come, Lanval fell into a depressive state, as Guinevere left in tears, deeply hurt by his transgression. Court was quickly called, as Arthur demanded why a knight would say such harsh words to his queen, fed a falsified story by his wife. Lanval was charged to defend his honor, and produce the lady on whose name he swore, meant to determine if the statement was of malice or true intent. The knight, however, well aware of her disappearance, showed no intent of doing so, only saved by Sir Gawain, famous for his tale with the Green Knight who covered Belle. On the day of the trial, it seemed all hope was lost, before, in its final minutes, the lady appeared, coming forth to save her love and showing he had no ill intent. We're once again given a happy ending, as Lanval rides off with her to Avalon. The story is our first example with the fairy trait of seduction, and a romance clearly following the Arthurian tradition of the period. A classic love tale, fulfilling the fantasies of love-forsaken knights and featuring a quite standard version of the Potiphar's wife trope, where a powerful married woman makes unwanted advances toward a virtuous subordinate, leading to false accusations and an unjust fate. Though perhaps more interesting still is the ripple effects the poem had through the modern period, with its most clear connection being La Belle Dame sans Merci, penned by John Keats in 1819. A classic of English literature, it recounts the tale of a knight seduced by a fairy's child, then left desolate to walk the world in grief. Though incredibly powerful, it sits at only 48 lines in length, short enough that I shall do a full reading. Oh, what can ail thee, knight-at-arms, alone and palely loitering? The sedge has withered from the lake, and no birds sing. Oh, what can ail thee, knight-at-arms, so haggard and so woe-begone? The squirrel's granary is full, and the harvest done. I see a lily on thy brow, with anguish moist and fever dew, and on thy cheeks a fading rose fast withereth too. I met a lady in the meads, full beautiful, a fairy's child. Her hair was long, her foot was light, and her eyes were wild. I made a garland for her head, and bracelets too, and fragrant zone. She looked at me, and she did love, and made sweet moan. I sat her on my pacing steed, and nothing else saw all day long, for sidelong would she bend and sing a fairy song. She found me roots of relish sweet, and honey wild, and manna dew, and sure in language strange she said, I love thee true. She took me to her elfin grot, and there she wept and sighed full sore, and there I shut her wild eyes with kisses for. And there she lulled me asleep, and there I dreamed, ah, woe betide, the latest dream I ever dreamt, on the cold hillside. I saw pale kings and princes too, pale warriors, death pale were they all. They cried, La Belle Dame sans Merci, thee hath in thrall. I saw their starved lips in the gloam, with horrid warning gaped wide, and I awoke and found me here, on the cold hillside. And this is why I sojourn here, alone and palely loitering, though the sedge has withered from the lake, and no birds sing. The connections between it and Lanval should be immediate, though it's unclear if John Keats ever interacted with Marie de France's work. Regardless, the poem stands as a classic ballad of the Romantic movement, and puts on full display the lasting impact of medieval folktale through English literature. Remaining in the modern, we traverse north across the Humber to the realm of Caledonia, where the rich Gaelic tradition remains ever present, and where in 1802 Sir Walter Scott published Thomas the Rhymer, a poetic tale where the aforementioned man meets the fairy queen, is taken to Elfinland, and receives the gift of prophecy, with later parts containing numerous predictions of Scotland's future. Though it was published in the 19th, the poem is not an original, but rather an adaptation of the romance produced by Thomas Ercildown of the 13th century. Known by the varied nickname given in the poem, Thomas was a reported prophet, allegedly predicting the death of King Alexander III, whose end plunged the nation into turmoil and set the stage for King Edward's invasion. Though in this instance the fairy queen is an explanation for Thomas's abilities, so too do abductions occur in the Scottish realm. Take for instance that of Wee Johnny, a classic folktale about a young boy abducted by fairies and replaced by a changeling, with the parents over time becoming increasingly aware of their son's strange behavior, before witnessing their infant boy stand in his crib and speak to the local tailor, eventually driving him away and receiving their wee Johnny once more. It's a narrative which fundamentally relayed on many superstitions of the era, highlighting how the supernatural was often given as explanation for strange behavior, or cause of many ailments. Returning, however, to the Arthurian tradition, we're led to the final and most famous tale of our collection. The Chanson de Geste, an old French epic, upholds the fairy king Oberon to be a child of Julius Caesar and the enchantress Morgan Le Fay, featuring him as a prominent character. It was this narrative, among others, which gained increased recognition in early modern England, being heard by one William Shakespeare, who took them as inspiration for one of his most prominent plays. A Midsummer Night's Dream, first performed between 1594 to 96, covers the tale of lovers Hermia and Lysander and their flight from Athens, as Hermia's father attempts to force her in marriage to another he better approves. The piece is an unequivocal romantic comedy, with their flight interrupted by the fairy king Oberon, who, in an attempt to divert Hermia's unwanted lover to another, mistakenly lays a spell upon Lysander, creating a confusing and comedic scene interrupted by the Duke Theseus, who demands Hermia listen to her patriarch and marry whom he pleases. The issue is resolved, however, by the spell Oberon had his servants lay, as the man attempting to force her into marriage, Demetrius, falls in love with another, promptly dissolving the request, with the aforementioned fairy king solving the problem by convincing the lovers they merely experienced a summer night's dream. The appearance of the Duke Theseus draws comparison with Geoffrey Chaucer's Knight's Tale, whilst the figure of Oberon blends the Arthurian tradition in as well. The play is perhaps the best display of medieval legend blending with classical mythology, as was so typical amidst the Northern Renaissance. I only hope this brief survey of literature from various periods may spark an interest in further reading. There are obvious examples I left out for sake of brevity, most notably the behemoth that is the Fairy Queen by Edmund Spenser, which I shall cover in a later video. As always, the reading list's in the description, and I hope to see you all soon. Thank you for watching.